Younger people are more
All right, welcome everyone. How's everyone doing?
good.
Hello,
thank
Zoom
you.
people as well. Not looking at them. Not looking at them.
No, why not? They are good people. They
They
are
are
more
won-
adept to electronics than me. I
They're
am not
they're
friendly.
they're wonderful people.
Everybody.
Wonderful.
It's on Zoom.
It's YouTube Live. YouTube Live. So we're talking about today, and last week we talked about a moral question, which was the free choice being taken away from Parah. So how can he be judged if he didn't have free choice? And we came down to the answer, the main answer being he had free choice. He abused his free choice, and so therefore it was taken away. Today we're going to look at another moral question, which is this borrowing from the Egyptians, where it's very clear there's no borrowing intended here. We are taking this. It's almost like we are being paid for our years of servitude. So if it's really payment or Egyptians are giving us this money, why is these things? Why is the Torah? Why is Kadosh Baruch Hu asking us to borrow from the Egyptians? Just say, take from the Egyptians, demand from the Egyptians, tell them we want payment. So we're going to have a look at this, and I want you to understand this isn't something which just comes up as a last minute thing. By the way, ask the Egyptians before you leave for some silver and gold. We're going to see that this is actually is part of the plan all the way back. This is part of the plan when God tells Abraham in the covenant between the parts, in the Brit Bein HaBetarim. This is part of the plan that Moshe is told at the sneh, at the burning bush. This is not by the way, it'd be nice to get a little bit of reparations here. This is really the main issue. So we have to try and understand if this is a main part of the plan, what is going on. So have a look and jump in straight away at source number 1. And again, understand where this is happening. This is happening after Choshech, after darkness, and before Makat Bechorah, before the killing of the firstborn, before Rosh Chodesh, before Korban Pesach. But this is an important part of the Jewish people leaving Mitzrayim. So it says here in chapter 11, Daber na be'oznei ha'am, please speak into the ears of the people. That's the Egyptian people. The Jewish people. V'yish'alu ish me'et re'ehu, v'isha me'et re'uta, klei kesef u'klei sahav. So tell the people to borrow each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers objects of silver and gold. Vayiten Hashem et chen ha'am be'enei Mitzrayim, and God placed grace or favor of the Jewish people in the eyes of the Egyptians. Gam ha'ish Moshe gadol me'od be'eretz Mitzrayim, and not only that, Moshe was considered a very great man in the land of Egypt. Be'enei avdei paro uve'enei ha'am, in the eyes of the servants or the slaves of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of the whole Egyptian society. So we're saying here, go and do this. And by the way, you should know this isn't going to be that difficult because everyone has kavod, has honor for Moshe, and since they have honor for Moshe, they'll have honor for the Jewish people. So what we're asking you to do is going to be particularly straightforward. The Jewish people are now on a high level. Yes, they were slaves for many years, but now they are well respected, and the Egyptians will want to do this. Now, as I foreshadowed right at the beginning of the session, this is part of the covenant between God and Avraham. You see there in source number 2, it says, Vayomer Avram, and God said to Avram, and he was still Avram, Yadoa Teda, you shall surely know, Ki ger yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem, that your descendants shall be aliens in a land not their own, Va'avadum v'inu otam, and they will be subjugated as slaves and mistreated, Arba me'ot shana, for a period of 400 years. V'gam et hagoy asher yavodu dan anochi, and that nation I will also judge them, those ones who made them slaves. V'achareichen, and afterwards, yetzu b'rechush gadol, they will leave with great wealth. Okay, so there's other questions we can ask on these psukim. Like, again, it's part of that discussion we had last week, which is, why are the Egyptians being punished if the verse says that they have to afflict the Jewish people for 400 years? And again, there's all those positions of you can make people slaves, you don't have to mistreat them quite as much or quite as happily as they did, etc., etc. But the point which I brought this verse here is, part of the covenant, part of the promise to Abraham is that they will leave with great wealth. And this great wealth is integral, it's critical to understanding what's happening here. So let's understand this approach from a Gemara. And the Gemara wants to connect these verses. It comes from Brachot Tet Amud Aleph, and it wants to explain what exactly is happening here. So the Gemara says, Daber na belznei, so it quotes our verse, speak into the ears of the Jewish people. Amar debei Rabbi Yanai. And you want to see the English, you can turn over the page. Speak to the house of Rabbi Yana. Says the house of Rabbi Yana, that's the school. The Rabbi Yana, Ein na ela lashon bakasha. This word na means a request. So why is God making a request to the Jewish people? Command them, tell them, do this. So Amar le HaKadosh Baruch Hu le Moshe. God said to Moshe, "B'vakasha mimcha lech ve'emor lehem Yisrael." I have a request of you. Please go and say to the Jewish people, "B'vakasha mikem," I request of you, "Sha'alu miMitzrayim," ask the Egyptians for klei chesed v'klei zahav. Ask them for their silver and gold. Shelo Yomar, why does God need to make this request of Moshe, and Moshe make this request of the Jewish people? Shelo Yomar oto tzaddik, so that righteous person, being Avraham, va'avadum ve'inu otam kiyem bahem, va'archechen yetzu b'rechush gadol lo kiyem bahem. So Avraham will not come around and say to God, as it were, by the way, yes, you afflicted my people, but you didn't give them the great wealth that you promised. So it's almost like the Gemara is trying to say to us, Hashem was in a sticky place. You know, I promised them slavery. They got the slavery. I also promised Abraham great wealth. They haven't got it. So I don't want to be held out on a technicality of, I promised it and I didn't deliver it. So that's why this is happening right to the end before they leave Mitzrayim. The Gemara continues and actually says something rather different, which is a fascinating thing. It says, Amru lo, halavai shenetzeh ba'atzmenu. You know, what's going on here? It says, we wish that we could just become free. We don't need any money. You know, we've been slaves for probably 100 plus years. We've been living in Mitzrayim for 200 plus years. We just want to get out of there. What are you doing? We're going to have money. Like mashal. What's the equivalent? La adam shayach chavush b'veit hasurim. You got a person who's imprisoned in jail. V'hayu omrim lo b'nei adam, and people come and say to him, motziin otcha lemacha mibeit hasurim. We're going to get you out of jail tomorrow, and we're going to give you a ton of money. But Omar lahem, you know, he would say to them, just take me out today, and I don't need any money. Like it's a rather interesting thing. So what's going on here is it's a slightly different take. In the first part of the Gemara, it wants to say, why do we need to ask? Because Hashem's in trouble with Abraham, and we've got to make sure that God fulfills his promises, as it were. Again, more tongue in cheek. But the second piece is, the Jews don't care about money. What do the Jews want? Freedom. We want to get out of Egypt. getting the gold and the silver, it's kind of like secondary. And not only that, I just trying to paraphrase, this gold and silver is a problem. This is what made the Egel HaZahav. Yes, it made the Mishkan as well. These gifts, the gold, the silver, and everything else, they were the primary donations which the Jewish people gave in order to build the Mishkan in Parashiot, Truma, Tetzaveh, and Vayakel Pekudei. But it also, in Ki Tisa, they also had, that was the gold they had. Like, how did slaves have all this money? How they have all this wealth? It came from this. So these possessions weren't necessarily a good thing for the Jews, which is, when you have your own stuff, what are you going to use it for? You're going to use it to serve Hashem, or you're going to use it to serve idolatry. So it's almost like you gave us too much temptation with this silver and gold, and how we deal with it. Like, so Rav Yana is like saying, if you asked anyone, they're in jail, we're going to get you out, and tomorrow we're going to take you to a beautiful resort, and you're going to have everything you need. I don't need the resort. I just want to get out of it. Maybe it'd be nice. I got a better plan for you. We'll spend 40 years roaming the desert. That might be a better plan.
You're going to spend the gold in the desert for 40 years.
Yeah. So I want to now switch tacks, and in the next sources, we are actually going to get to the real crux of it, which is we look like thieves, which is ever since the Torah was translated into Greek, forced translation. And I mentioned this on the fast of the 10th of Tevet. One of the things which we fast over is the fact that the Torah was forced to be translated. The Greek king there, I think it was Ptolemy, made 70 sages, according to the Talmud, 70 sages be in 70 rooms, and made them translate the Tanakh into Greek. From that moment, and a great miracle happened, and they all made the same translations, and they all, wherever it was a contentious translation, they were careful to make sure that to use a euphemism or to use things to not make it look incriminating. But here you read these verses, and not only in chapter 11 and chapter 12, which we're going to see what happens, but also from chapter 3 at the burning bush, and also all the way back in Bereshit, it looks like we pulled a fast one on the Egyptians. We said, we want to borrow your silver and gold, and we took it. And the difficulty is, once you have translations, the non-Jews can look at us and say, thieves, you stole from the Egyptians. I want you to have a look at source number 5. By the way, source number 4 is just telling you that Bnei Israel did what Moshe asked. They did borrow from the Egyptians the silver and gold and the clothing, and they did have grace in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they did borrow, and they stripped the land of Egypt. But in source number 5, and you can see the translation over the page, this is a discussion. We'll read it inside in the Hebrew. This actually came about. The Jews were put on trial during the period of Alexander the Great. He was the master over the known world, and different cities and countries peoples came to him with different claims. And he's brought here, Shuv Pamachat. If you want to look at that Gemara in Sanhedrin, there's a number of cases brought to him. Ba'u b'nei Mitzrayim, the Egyptians came, Ladun in Yisrael, and they brought judgments against the Jewish people. Lifnei Alexandrus Mokdon, that's how they call Alexander the Great, or Alexander the Macedonian. Amrullah, they said to him, Harehu Omer, behold, in their Torah. How did they know the Torah? It's now been translated. Hashem natanet chein ha'am b'nei Mitzrayim v'yashilum. God gave them grace in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they borrowed all of the gold and the silver. Says the Egyptians, Tnulanu kesef hazav shenitaltem mimenu. We want our gold and silver back, which you borrowed. Okay? You stole it. You were borrowing it. You never gave it back. So now it's the Jewish people's turn to defend themselves. Amar lahen, mehecha natem mevi'in raya. Where are you bringing your proof? He says to the Egyptians. Amru lo min Torah. They said to him, from your Torah. Amar lahen. He said to them, Afani lo avi lachem raya ela min Torah. You know what? Since you're quoting from the Bible, I'll quote from the Torah too. Shene Emar, as the verse states, Umoshav b'nei Yisrael asher yashu b'Mitzrayim shloshim shana v'arba meot shana. And the Jewish people dwelt in the land of Egypt for 430 years. Tenu lanu schar avodah shel shishim ribo sheshia batem b'Mitzrayim shloshim shana v'arba meot shana. What do you want? I want the wages for working in Egypt, 600,000 men who worked in Egypt for 430 years. You know what? You want to bring a pasuk that we stole silver and gold, that we borrowed it. You know what? We worked for all that time. We want to get some, we want to get paid. Amar lahen Alexander Smakdon. Hechziu lot tshuva. So Alexander the Great loved this. He said, you know what? The Jews have a good point. This is very compelling. What's your answer, Egyptians? Amru lo, ten lanu zman shlosha yamim. Can you give us 3 days? This is a really good rebuttal. We don't know what to do. Natan lahem zman, batku v'lo matzu tshuva. They gave them 3 days, and they didn't have a compelling answer to the claims. Okay, but what is this Gemara coming to tell us? The Gemara is coming to tell us this is a legitimate claim against the Jewish people. You look at this verse, and non-Jews who read the Torah, if they have a bent against us, they could say, look, Jews, you stole from the Egyptians. Now we have an answer. No, that was reparations for 400 years of tyranny, of slavery. But you know what? Don't let a good answer get in the way of anti-Semitism. People will use will use whatever they want. I mean, that's always the case. We're going to quote out of context and say, Jews, you stole, rather than saying, no, we were slaves. This was, this was for time well paid. The commentaries now really go to task at this. And, you could have a question. I always ask this question, which is my question in 2023 really a question, or is it just my mind? Like, is it a new question or is it an old question? So the Talmud, 1,500 years ago, 1,800 years ago, this was clearly an issue. But it was an issue throughout the ages. This has still been a problem, which is, are Jews, are we considered ethical and moral? Are we considered, to be, have we stolen or not? Now, this was a question for the Talmud. The Talmud wants to bring it down and say, we have an answer. But guess what? It doesn't say at the end of that, and they paid. The Egyptians did not pay any more money. Like, it should have been, the judgment shouldn't have been fair and square. It should have been, you know what? However much the Jews took, they should have been paid even more than that, and you Egyptians should pay more. But the Gemara doesn't conclude that. The Gemara concludes, okay, they had no answer, end of story. It should have been, there should have been more reparations, which is, you know what, we could talk about Germans paying, reparations after World War II. Perhaps they should pay even more. And what they're doing is not enough. And can you put a price on killing people or murdering people? Can you put a price on you can put a price on stealing assets, homes, and possessions, etc. But you could argue, murdering people and treating them as subhuman. How can you put a price on that? So the Jews, the Jewish people, they had a much stronger claim. But the Gemara concludes that yes, the Jews are right, but as always, the Jews don't necessarily get the right answer. And again, I'm not saying whether the Talmud, it's a piece of Agadah. I'm not sure whether it happened or not. that story. That story is coming to illustrate that you can bring that non-Jews can attack us. You can have an impartial non-Jewish person who can say the Jews are correct, but at the same time still not want to make a judgment. And I think we've had that in Jewish history where people would say, you know what, Jews, we kicked the Israelis, we kicked out the Palestinians, and they were forced to run away. And what's my answer? You kicked out almost more than that, more than 1 million Jews from Arab lands. Where are their reparations? Where are their, and you don't hear that in the news as much. You don't,
Never.
it's
Unless it's Jewish news.
it's in correct. It's in Jewish news, but it's really not in the world, which is, Jews lived in Arab countries since
before Islam started.
Correct, for longer, for 2,000 years, side by side, and they had huge assets, possessions, materials, possessions, and they weren't allowed to leave. I mean, I had, when I lived in Melbourne, we had a congregation where a lot of the Jews were from Egypt, and they talked about they were only allowed to go with a suitcase of clothes, and they checked before they left. They couldn't take out anything, or if they were able, they really had to smuggle it out. Like they had to basically leave all their businesses, everything. They couldn't sell them. They couldn't take anything. Like it was like, you're out of here. Like it's a really a very challenging time. But you never get today people talking about this. All it is this craziness of the Jews kicked out these people from their homes,
and that was after the Arabs refused the partition.
Correct. All of those things. And again, but I'm saying, even if you want to agree and say you have some kind of sympathy, you want to say, there is an equivalency going on here. So I'm saying we can always argue that. Arabs have always denied everything and everything else and everything. What I'm saying is, if you want to go and say they have a legitimate claim, I would say, well, if you have a legitimate claim, we also have a legitimate claim. And if you don't want to accept that, it's all there. So I'm saying, when we read these parashiot, and it's a very simple thing, the Jews asked to borrow silver and gold, and they took it with them. You can say, okay, it's one story, that's the end. And what I'm trying to tell you is, this story is the story which carries on throughout time, which is, are we legitimate? Are we the legitimate citizens of the world? Can we have claims, financial claims, against when we are mistreated? Or are we just seen as, the aggressors? And this is a problem, which is, again, I'm a lover of the Rambam. The Rambam loves to say, Ma'aseh Avot, Siman Lebanim. Whatever happened to our ancestors, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, it has an impact on us. But also, whatever has happened in Jewish history, especially in the Tanakh to the Jewish people, impacts us. So we were mistreated, we were imprisoned, we were made slaves, and yes, we went out with money, but even that is questions and everything, which is, how could anyone question the Jewish people about whether they took more than they gave when they were enslaved in Egypt? Like, Paro was willing to lose all of Mitzrayim. He was really, his servants told him, don't you realize that Egypt is lost? Haterem teda ki avadu Mitzrayim, that Egypt is lost? And he wouldn't go for it because he was obsessed that the Jews were his people, were his slaves. They were his possessions. He couldn't give it over. So, yeah.
I don't understand your question of, or where it comes from here, that are the Jews legitimate to live or something you just said. Where does that come from? So good. I made a little bit of a jump, which is when the world has its discussions of morality, of who are the worst countries in the world, who's doing the most terrible things. Like you think about the United Nations and how many resolutions are made. I'm not trying to get political. I'm trying to tell you, this has been our history throughout time, comes from this, which is, if the UN was coming now,
that type of thing, which is instead of saying we legitimately defend ourselves and occasionally there are issues and we examine them properly and bring, and hold people accountable, there is this issue that we are wrong. So to hear it, there's a legitimate question. Did the Jews mislead the Egyptians by saying we're borrowing, or did they know, the Egyptians themselves know, I know they're asking to borrow, but perhaps they really knew. Again, we'll see this in these commentaries coming up. They knew what was going on. But let's say the Egyptians at that time knew that. But the fact that Talmud could bring us a story is illustrative of it doesn't matter. I don't think that the Arabs who fled Jerusalem and other places during the establishment of the State of Israel, during the 1948 War of Independence, I don't think at that time they thought that they were, they just thought, okay, we ran away, we lost our stuff. It's only later that now it becomes a question. So I think
in 64 with Arafat, he invented the Palestinian nation.
Correct. All those things. So I'm saying we're living in a time where, thank God no one's coming and quoting the Tanakh and saying Jews stole from the Egyptians. But the Talmud is saying, well, that was a question. Mm-hmm. Maybe that was at the time. There was a legitimate thing, which is we stole it. And let's say that's not a question then. It's a question now. Did we steal? When we think about the three places where Jews paid for the land of Israel, we paid for the Marat HaMachpelah, where the Avot and Imahot are buried. We paid for Kever Yosef, where Yosef is buried. And we paid for Har HaBayit, where the Beit HaMikdash stood. Those are the most contentious sites in Israel, and it's written in the Tanakh that we purchased them in cash for huge amounts, more than they were worth at the time. And those are the most contentious sites. So people are always going to use the Torah against us because it's translated. I want to have a look a little bit more and see these next three commentaries, and I'll extend it a little bit more what I'm thinking, which is this question of morality. Are Jews moral? I believe that we are the most moral people who've ever lived. And at the same time, we have made mistakes, and there have been occasions where we may have done the wrong thing. But we are the ones who make such a big deal about it, and we would examine ourselves and make inquiries. So this question, did we borrow with false integrity, is a serious question for ourselves, not because of any anti-Semitism or any quotes from the outside, but for ourselves. Did we mislead the Egyptians in any way? Is a legitimate question, because we always want to be above board. And if that question is coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God is asking us to borrow, is that a problem? So I want to see this, and I want you to see how the commentaries address this, because they basically explain this word vayashilum, they borrowed, is of vayishalu, please borrow, was not actually, no one assumed borrow was literal. They all knew borrow was a euphemism for take, give to us. I didn't bring it here, but there's a midrash, and I should have brought it, and I apologize for not having it in the source sheets, that during the plague of Choshech, during the plague of darkness, the midrash says not only was it darkness you couldn't see, it was a physical darkness that the Egyptians couldn't move. And it was during that time the Jews were walking around in their homes. They knew exactly where things were, and they could have taken, and they didn't, because they did have the morality not to take.
You're saying they didn't take anything?
During the period of darkness.
Yeah.
They could have said, you know
but
what?
They walked around like taking stock.
It's true. It's true. They did take stock, but they took stock without taking.
Right.
You could have said, you could have said, what they shouldn't have gone in. They shouldn't have gone into the house at all. You could have said it's not their houses. They shouldn't have done it. But the fact that they did, and didn't take, I think is a very is very telling. So Rabbeinu Bachia here in source number 6, he says this request was not similar to a man or a woman asking his or her respective neighbor for some tool on the understanding that after he or she has finished using it would be returned to its owner. Here, God's instructions were to ask for their respective items as outright gifts. It was understood that God would make the Egyptians feel well disposed towards the Israelites, so they would willingly comply with their requests for such gifts. I mean, that's the whole point in the verse. The verse says, please borrow. Next verse, by the way, the Egyptians looked up to the Jews.
Because of fear?
Out of fear, because of the plagues. After the plagues, again, what was the purpose of the plagues? The purpose of the plagues was to bring awareness that Hashem was a true God. And the Jewish people served the one true God. So by their reverence, fear, honor, respect of God, they revered, feared, and honored the Jewish people, again, who were once their slaves. The last thing God had in mind was that the Israelites, at the very moment when their redemption was at hand, would leave behind the impression that they had fooled their neighbors and pretended they would give back the items in question. Okay, says the Rabbeinu Bachia, it's completely, it's no, you can't say that. If you think they were stealing, what are you talking about? Although to Jewish law, according to Jewish law, whenever a servant is released from service after he has toiled for the agreed period of time, he is entitled to receive a stake from his erstwhile master to enable him to start his economic independence. This is spelled out in Devarim, chapter 15. When you send him away free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. Furnish him out of your flocks, your threshing floor, and vat with which the Lord has blessed you. If this law applies to a treatment of a fellow Jew servant whose wages the master has paid 6 years in advance, how much more so were the Jewish slaves in Egypt entitled to receive some silver trinkets in compensation for over 200 years of slavery for which no wages had ever been paid? So the Rabbeinu Bachia, he has two answers. Number one, it's a euphemism. No one, when they said that we're going to borrow from you, the Egyptians knew exactly what they were doing. This was normal. And number two, even if you want to say that was a problem, if you want to, this was reparations. So if you want to say they were forced to give it was reparations. And so therefore, there's no issue whatsoever. The Rashbam there in source number 7 says, Vayishalu l'shem matana gemura. This word borrowing is really the language of a complete gift. How do we know this? As it says in Tehillim, Sha'al mimeni vetna goyim nachalatcha. Ask of me, and I will give you your inheritance. Give meaning a permanent gift.
Are there other, is the word throughout Chumash?
No, so that's the question, which is when you have this phrase lish'ol, to borrow or to ask, if in other places it means borrow, ask, then that's the whole thing of the ambiguity of texts. Do we say that every time this word comes up, it should be a language of borrowing, or do we say that no, here? Everywhere else it means that, but here specifically, we're going to use this more narrow version where it's not really asking, borrowing. It's really, we know it means, I'm asking you to give what I deserve.
You could also say, thank you. Lishol, to ask, is like to ask for something.
Yeah.
Like if you leave out the word, I could see how you could
words are going to return it.
Yeah.
When you say, "Can I have?"
Yeah.
You're asking for something. And I was also going to say before. Sometimes I say to my neighbor, like, "Can I borrow something?"
Right, a cup of sugar. You're not going to return a cup of sugar.
Some people are like, careful to always do that, but sometimes I even have to remind myself, don't say borrow, because I'm planning to just, can I have? And it sounds weird. So you regularly say, "Can I borrow?"
Right. We could be very medactic. We could be very That's exactly the interpretation there. That's what the Rashbam is saying. It's colloquial. When I say, "Can I borrow some silver?" it's, "Can I borrow some sugar?"
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And then the Chizkuni is saying, I'll just say it outside, that It really was. The Jews left behind their property. They couldn't take everything with them. And so therefore, the gold and silver was in exchange for
houses.
the houses and the property they left back. Now, this one I don't stand as much because they may originally have had houses and stuff. I think as they were
Once they
slaves,
became slaves.
I don't know if they had it. Now, I do want to bring back, and I can't remember which commentary it was that said the reason why we had to borrow the silver and gold and not take the silver and gold by force and demand it was so the Egyptians would chase after us. And it's saying it was more part of the actual strategy. So that one would say we had to be immoral in order to get them. Like you had to example, you wake up after the killing of the firstborn, everyone's son's has died. You can imagine everyone wants to go. And we understand Paro's motivation because his heart had been hardened by God, so he didn't have any free choice, and he was just a puppet, and he had to go and chase. But how did he get the Egyptians to go with them? Says that commentary, and again, I'm sorry it's not on top of my head who that was, really says that was the motivation for the Egyptians to go chase back. And they're saying, come on, let's go and get back our silver and gold. Now, the reason why I don't like that commentary is it doesn't really fit the facts, which is if they had chen, if they had grace in your eyes a day before, and you acknowledge who the true God is, and that is Hashem, and now he's just brought about the most destructive plague the world has ever seen of makat becharot, of killing of the firstborn, that's not going to be your motivation for chasing after. It's far more that Paro managed to get them to go because he's their leader, and he made them go, rather than he's like saying, oh, let's go, there's going to be great silver and gold to capture. It doesn't seem to be as compelling.
It was his army. It wasn't the
right.
The person on the street. It wasn't your next door neighbor.
Correct. It was 600 heavy horses, chariots. Like they were, yeah. And the army had to go.
Your neighbor next door wasn't running after the Jews. He was sitting home scared.
Right.
So I'm reading all of this, and I'm seeing what is the question that I have, which is my mind is always driven to the Torah is not a historical event, period. The Torah is almost screaming to me, Ben, read the Torah. See how contemporary it is. See how this question the Gemara brings down of us. I'm not worried about Abraham and whether Abraham is saying, you promised them silver, bring them silver, because I'd be like, you know what, I want to get out. I don't care about any gifts. I'm far more concerned about this position. Would people say that we stole? This has been our claim throughout history, where people just have these ridiculous demands on us that we're not ethical and moral. We are ethical and moral, and guess what? There are those amongst us who do the wrong thing. But my belief is when someone does the wrong thing, we call them out, whether it's as a government, whether it's whether it's locally, whether it's community. When we have people do the wrong thing as Jews, we tell people, that's not what we do. That's not our way. So I'm seeing this, and I'm reading Rabbeinu Bachia. It's very compelling to me. Can I borrow some silver and gold? Can I borrow a cup of sugar? It means I want to be, we're asking, but we're really telling you to give it to us. And if you don't like that answer, then it's reparations. It's payment for those years of slavery in Mitzrayim. And so therefore, however way you dice it, whether it's we asked but we were taking, or whether it's reparations, there's no question for me to answer. And do I think it is that it was the hook to get the Egyptians to come chase after us? No, I think they already had the hook. The hook was from God had hardened Paro's heart, so Paro ends up being a puppet, and he's so convinced that he's going to drive himself all the way into the sea. So this is it. We as Jews don't need to apologize for being Jews. We are the most moral and ethical people. It's in our DNA that we are moral and ethical. It's who we are. It's what we stand for. And so therefore, I'm reading the text. I need to get back to it. And so vishalu, we're asking to take is the interpretation. It's not we're asking to borrow. The borrow is a euphemistic term. It has to be that's what's going on. And if you don't like that, then for sure it's these are reparations. And we as Jewish people, we have nothing to defend ourselves. We have it. And as we said, the Egyptians, they left with their tails between their legs, according to the Talmud. So there we are. And there we have it.
This kind of makes me think about what's happening today, that we don't